Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies. Today we're going to look at a basic but essential terrain project. We're going to look at how to make and paint rocks. This is one of those hobby projects that really goes a long way. And it doesn't really require a lot of specific skills or tools to do it, and mainly just uses spares and cutoffs from your other projects. And that's building rocks. Rocks obviously are everywhere, and that makes them really important if you're a wargamer or even if you're a diorama builder. You can use rocks pretty well for everything. Now there's a lot of different ways to build rocks. Sometimes you can see plaster molds for them. You can buy pre-made ones, but I find it really easy just to make them myself. And the skill set for it's pretty straightforward. All you need are cutoffs of insulation foam. And if you build dioramas or terrain, you should have a lot of that around. So let's get started. I grab my marker and I go to my sheet of cardboard, and just making sure I know which way the grain is going, I draw the rough outline of the piece of terrain I'm going to build. I want to make it a little smaller than the piece of terrain's total footprint on the board. Okay, there we go. So there's one clump of rocks I'm going to make. Then I go and do the same thing on another level, because I think I'll build two clumps of rocks. Alright, I'll make this one a little different shape. There we go. Now with that done, I'm going to grab my craft knife and I'm going to go in and I'm just going to cut them out. And you want to use an old blade because when you're cutting cardboard with a craft knife, it'll dull the blade very quickly. Alright, so my pieces are out. Now, one sheet of cardboard on its own is not a terribly strong piece of terrain, so what you want to do is see which way the grain goes. So in this case, it's facing this end. What I want to do is I want to orient it so that the next level I cut for each piece of terrain has the grain going at a right angle in the opposite direction. So there, we want to go there now. Now going back to where I was before, I grab my marker and I map out a slightly wider section of terrain around the original cut. You'll see why in a minute. It kind of creates a beveled edge in the terrain when we build it. And the second piece. Then I number them just to keep them straight. Alright, and then just like before, I go back to my knife and I cut out the piece. Alright, so now I have both parts cut out. Line them up just to make sure they fit okay. I want to make sure I don't have a uniform edge, something sort of natural looking in shape, and I want to make sure that those cardboard grains are now at right angle to each other, which they are in that piece, and they look fine on the other piece. So, moving from here, it's time to glue them together, so I grab my hot glue gun, and I just run a bead of glue roughly around where the top piece will go, and I fasten it down. Same on the other side. I'll press it down to make sure it's sealed well. Alright, I'll pull off some of this extra paper on the edges or glue that's hanging out. Make sure the edge is fairly clean. Okay, there we go. So they're ready for the next step, and to do this, we need to grab some tape. So we'll grab some masking tape, and we'll start running the masking tape around the edge of the pieces. We want to make sure we cover both layers so it creates a bit of a bevel or a slope between the height of both layers, and that we wrap the whole side and seal off the ends of the cardboard grain. Okay, so that's done. Now we need to make the rocks themselves. So grabbing a knife, I'll get some of my extra styrofoam, and I'll just start cutting random chunks out of it. You want to make it kind of haphazard, all different shapes. Sometimes I go back and cut grooves into them. Some are smooth, some are rough, all different sizes. Of course, it depends on the scale of what you're building too, as to how big or how small you want to make these parts. I like to make them quite rough so that they have a lot of texture. All right, there we go. So there's a decent pile. You can make as many or as few as you want for each base. Then with your hot glue again, you go in, start putting the glue down, and you fasten the rocks back to the base. You can cluster them together or spread them out. It's up to you. I like to put some larger ones to the middle and some smaller ones to the side. This piece will probably be used for wargaming, so I want to make sure that it's spread out enough that I can stand models on and around the base without too much trouble. Okay, so there we have it. All the rocks are glued down, and we got to move on to the next step. And that will be to get some grit on the bases themselves. So grab your craft glue and some water. I pour the craft glue into a cup. Add some water to make it kind of a paste. Doesn't have to be too thin at this point. And I'll grab an old brush, I'll stir it up. You want to use a stiff bristle brush, nothing good quality obvious for this. This is really hard on the brush. And you just go start applying the glue. You can put the glue right on the rocks. That's important if you want to spray paint this at some point in time. You'll need the glue to seal the rocks because propellant and spray paints will dissolve styrofoam if you're not careful. I'm not going to spray paint it, I don't think, in this case, but it's still good to get it covered. All right, now I'll go get something really coarse in terms of grain. This is some decorative kind of crushed glass that actually my mother-in-law gave me. It's from IKEA, and then my normal little tub of sand and kitty litter. This is an 80% sand to 20% kitty litter mixture, roughly. Make sure your kitty litter is clean. So taking my coarse grain, I start dropping it down onto the terrain, and then after I'm satisfied with that, I go and grab some of my finer grit, and I just start spreading it down at random. It'll stick down to the glue. There we have it. So I get a full coverage, and I let some of it overlap onto the rocks. It just enhances the texture of the rocks a bit. Now it's time to make sure that glue is good and stuck down. So we'll go back to the rubbing alcohol method. I pour up some rubbing alcohol in a cup. And I think I'll spread it with a pipette. So I get a plastic pipette, like an eyedropper, and I start spreading it out over the base. And this is a good technique if you're a miniature painter, a wargame miniature painter. This is a good way to stick down grit to the bases of your individual models as well. So I use this on my Flames of War models all the time. Alright, now a little more water back in my glue. So this is the same glue as before, but I'm just making it much more watery. And I've mixed in some black acrylic paint. Black acrylic paint goes in there to just help flow around the rocks and sort of pre-shade the grit. So here we go. So using the pipette again, I start dropping it on. I try to get a good coat. I'll put some on the rocks too. Again, you want to put the glue on the rocks to make the rocks a little more rigid and protect them. And you're not going to get a perfect undercoat with this. This is just to eliminate room for error when you're undercoating later. The rubbing alcohol, with it breaks the capillary action, it tends to push the paint into areas which is hard to reach when you're undercoating. So I leave that to dry overnight. Here it is finished, so it's good to get a proper undercoat on now. So I'll go back to the same acrylic black paint, put it in a cup, and I'm going to water it down quite a lot. You could use spray paint at this point if you wanted. Again, watching out to make sure you don't melt your own styrofoam, but since it's just a small terrain project, I'm just going to go ahead and use acrylic paint. Plus, a lot of people don't think about it, but acrylic paint has a lot of adhesive properties itself. So if you put a fairly thick layer of acrylic paint down over your grit or your flock, it'll just help that much more to hold it in place and protect the model itself. So I spread it around fairly thickly. This is one of those projects where you got to paint from different angles in order to get into the nooks and crannies. We've used the rubbing alcohol and the paint and the glue to help with that, but it's always a good idea to be extra careful. All right, so now we're finished up. Obviously we can't get any further along on this for now, so we got to let it dry. All right, so everything is dried overnight, and we're ready to start on coloring the base. So we put some dark brown paint down, grab a cheap kind of ratty brush, dip it in, and wipe most of the paint off. We're going to do a lot of dry brushing here. There we go. Sometimes on the base layers you can put a thicker coat of dry brushing down. So I start putting it on, hitting the highlights on it. So that part's complete. Now I'm going to move on to a dark gray, and I'm going to go after the rocks and the larger pieces of grit. I just want to put some real contrast into the paint and accentuate some of the textures by hitting the high points with the dark gray. That's done now. So here's a view. We've done it on both bases. We're going to go on and keep building that texture. So we're going to grab increasingly lighter colors. So we'll move to like a light brown or a tan. And we'll dry brush that on. I'm using a finer brush now to get into the spots between the rocks with more precision. And I move on to a lighter tan color. Then I go back to a light gray, and I go back over the rocks and some of the larger stones on the ground, still bringing out the highlights. All right, now a trusty off-white that I'll brush over the whole thing, including the rocks and the ground. This sort of unifies the shades on the model. Then I'll go to a pure white, and I'll hit very lightly on the whole model again. And there we go, done, dry brushed. Now I've decided to add some grass. So I've previously made some grass. I have another video on this. If you want to check it out, I'll put the link in. And I grab my pin vise, pour a little more craft glue again. This is just straight glue. I don't need to water it down this time. And then grabbing my pin vise, I select a spot, I drill in a little hole, and then I push my clump of grass into place. And I do a few across the model just to sort of create more interest. So moving on from there, I water down my white glue and I spread it on thinly around the base in random patches, back around some of the grass clumps I put in, and I'm using it also to cover up any little errors I've made. Then taking my static grass applicator, I mix up a bunch of different colors of grass and shake them out over the glue. Now if you don't have a static grass applicator, don't worry. You can just sprinkle this by hand if you want. Static grass applicator just helps a little bit with getting the grass to stand up. If you're using it for wargaming, the grass will often just get pushed back down. Alright, I dump off the extra. That piece is done. Here they are both with the grass applied, and they are now complete. As you can see, this piece is pretty easy to build, but it does yield a really good result, and it looks great on your battlefield or in your diorama or on your model train spread. By changing the colors of the grass or the colors of the rocks, you can introduce a lot of different variety in terms of shades and colors and textures to your spread. That's it for this episode. Please stay tuned for new content twice weekly on Sundays and Thursdays. We are your source for regular model building, miniature painting, and diorama content. If you have not yet subscribed, make sure you do, and press the bell button to receive immediate notifications so you do not miss out. Miniature Landscape Hobbies has a Patreon account. If you would like to partner with us to help us maintain our regular content, please consider subscribing to one of our supporter levels, or make a one-time donation. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching, and as always, remember to keep building life in miniature.